Hello students, this is the next in your series of grammar capsules, and in this one we are looking at adverbs. You remember the general conditions about modifiers we have looked at in the previous segment on adjectives. So, this time we will just discuss the adverbs as such. Now, we know that an adverb modifies a verb, but it could also modify another adjective or another adverb. Samples: when I say the soldier walked briskly, then briskly modifies walked, the verb. But when I say Rajni has very neat handwriting, then I have already got an adjective in neat, and then I have got very as an adjective for neat, right. So, handwriting is described by an adjective neat, and neat is described by very. Now, when I say Rajni writes very neatly, then I have got neatly is an adverb because it describes, let us say, the writing, and then I have got very, which becomes an adverb that describes an adverb. So, in my first sample I have got an adverb that describes a verb, in my second sample I have got an adverb that describes an adjective, and my third sample I have got an adverb that describes an adverb. So, it can do all of these three things, right. And do not forget that an adverb can also modify phrases. Now, over here when I say Hari was coming behind me would be a phrase. So, when I say Hari was coming directly behind me or right behind me, I can actually have an adverb that modifies a phrase as well. So, these are what adverbs do, and do remember that the same thing applies to adverbial phrases and adverbial clauses also. Okay. So, let us move on. So, then there are these types of adverbs, right. Just like we looked at types of adjectives, I do not need to go through all of them, read them aloud because they are on the screen and you can look at them. But you have adverbs of time, we have the samples there, you have adverbs of place, you have adverbs of manner, you have adverbs of frequency, right, and you have adverbs of degree or quantity, you have adverbs of reason, and you have adverbs of affirmation or confirmation, right. So, just have a look at those samples and keep them in mind, because these are, and they are not the only lot, there are more as well, but these are the most often used ones, right. So, these then please keep in mind, you can have adverbs of time, place, manner, frequency, degree or quantity, reason and affirmation, different types of adverbs, and we will now see how it is that we actually use them. So, how do we place adverbs, right? When we looked at adjectives, we said we can use adjectives either directly, namely attributively, or we can use them predicatively depending on the emphasis that we want to bring in. With adverbs, however, it is a little more tricky because different types of adverbs we do different types of things. Now, if you look at adverbs of manner, place and time, they typically come after the verb if you are describing verbs, and manner, place and time can only describe verbs. They can't, because the manner of doing, place of doing, time of doing, it can't describe other adjectives or adverbs, right. So, manner, place and time, the adverb will generally come after the verb or after the direct object if there is an object. So, if I say Sita sings sweetly, then you recognize I have got the verb sings and I have got sweetly. But if I say Sita sings bhajans sweetly, then I have got Sita sings bhajans, that is the object, and then we would have to put sweetly after that. So, the adverb would come after the verb or after the, we will call it the entire verb situation or the verb and its object, the verb and the direct object, right. Now, if I say Sita sings songs to her grandmother, now you recognize if I say Sita sings songs, then songs becomes the object, and then to her grandmother or for her grandmother becomes an indirect object. Now, would I say Sita sings songs to her grandmother sweetly? Sometimes we do, but I can also look at Sita sings songs sweetly to her grandmother. In fact, Sita sings songs sweetly to her grandmother is actually much more relevant, because it is not, because otherwise the problem is that the sweetly goes too far away from the verb and the object, alright. Now, what about adverbs of frequency? Now, when you use adverbs of frequency, you actually have to place them between the subject and the verb always. So, Sita never sings songs. Now, if I say Sita never sings songs, then between Sita and sings I have never. If I say Sita always sings songs, you recognize the same thing. So, whenever we use adverbs of frequency, you place them between the subject and the verb. Now, if the verb is an existence verb, not an action word, the is, was, are, etc., etc., then the adverbs will come after the verb. So, if we want to describe the child is happy, okay, or the student is, let us say, clever, or the person is studious, you recognize whenever you use an existence verb, the adverb will come as a complement. Okay. So, let us expand that a little bit. Now, if I say the child is playing happily, now the child is playing is a sentence by itself. Now, because I have got playing, now I have got the is playing is a situation there, we are talking about continuous tense. So, if I use the is with the sentence, then the adverb has to come after the verb. So, the child is playing happily. I can't say the child is happily playing, whereas I could say the child is always playing, or the child never plays, is never playing. I can't say the child is playing, and because if I am really looking at the description of the playing, then the child is playing happily. So, whenever I use the is, right. So, when I say the child plays or the child always plays, then the verb is plays, but when the child is, when the verb is, the child is, then it will have to be after the verb. Okay, so the child is playing happily. Fine. So that becomes the placement as regards verbs and verb phrases. Now let's move on. Now if you are using an adverb to modify another modifier, an adjective or another adverb, there is no problem with that. Just remember that it comes before the adjective or another adverb. In other words, very much like an attributive adjective, these also the adverb comes before the adjective or adverb. Okay, but a few things that we must remember. If I want to use the word enough, right, I would normally place it after. I can't, even though notwithstanding the fact that large, by for instance, is a adjective by itself, I wouldn't place enough before large. I can't say is the house enough large. I can only say is the house large enough. All right. Do remember that about enough particularly. What about only? Only should actually be placed just before the word that you want to modify. Otherwise, it can cause confusion. If you say I could get only 2 hours of sleep, you very clearly recognize that the only actually defines 2. Correct? And therefore, only becomes an adverb that defines 2. Now suppose I move the only anywhere else. If you say I could only get 2 hours of sleep and not get only 2 hours of sleep, I could only get and I could not dream of. So it then becomes a different verb. You are actually describing the verb get, you are not describing the 2 hours of sleep, right? So over here there are actually 3 things that I could, the 2 things that I could deal with as adverbs. I could put the only before get, which is a verb, but that means I am talking about the getting and not about the dreaming or the letting go. Or I can put the adverb before the 2 or the only before the 2, which means I am talking about the number of hours of sleep that I got, but then because 2 is an adjective, only becomes an adverb for that. So whatever it is that you want to modify by way of an adjective, if there are multiple adjectives in the statement or multiple adverbs, then the one you actually want to modify is where you actually put the only. Okay, are we clear about that? So that's about the use of only. Let's move on. And we had a quick look at this when we were looking at sentence structure, but let's just deal with it quickly. We also realized that modifiers, whether they are adjectives or adverb modifiers, can actually come in slightly different ways. You have this thing that we call a dangling modifier, and that is when it is not clear what the sentence is supposed to modify. You've got a modifier, but you're not sure what it modifies, and then you have ambiguities because of that. So for instance, when we say she thought of him at home, now what is at home here is a modifier, right? It describes where she thought. But the fact is, was he at home or was she at home? We don't know. And therefore, there is absolute ambiguity here. You can't even interpret the sentence. She thought of him at home. So I have to shift it and say at home she thought of him, or she thought of him when he was at home. Then it becomes much clearer. So that is what we call a dangling modifier. Now misplaced modifier is where what I intend goes wrong and people misunderstand me because I placed the modifier in the wrong place. Now let's just look at this. Suppose I wanted to tell you that at a certain time today, this morning, this lady was looking for an orange and she found it this morning. Now if we want to say that, then how can we say it? Now if I say Abhi found the orange in the basket she had plucked this morning, that tells me something else. It's actually a correct sentence, but it tells me something else. It says that she was plucking oranges by the basket. She was plucking baskets and baskets of oranges. So she filled a basket, put it away, brought another basket, filled that, put it away. Now you call that plucking baskets of oranges. And therefore, if I say Abhi found the orange in the basket she had plucked this morning, I am saying in the basket of oranges that she had plucked this morning, she found an orange. So that doesn't make it a wrong sentence, but it doesn't tell you what I mean because I want to tell you this morning what she did. Now, Abhi found the orange she had plucked this morning in the basket. Now that shifts the this morning to her plucking of the orange, not her finding. Abhi found the orange she had plucked in the basket this morning. Now that seems to be what we are talking about, but then this morning is so far away that we are not too sure what it is that we want to qualify. So while 1 and 2 are correct statements there, they give you different meanings. 3 is ambiguous because it takes the this morning too far away from what we want to describe. So let's look at the fourth one. This morning, Abhi found the orange she had plucked in the basket. Now that tells you exactly this morning is about the finding. So you recognize what we mean by a misplaced modifier. You have to be careful when you watch these things to ensure that you understand exactly what it was supposed to modify and therefore where the modifier should be actually placed. Let's move on. This is the sequencing sample that we'd had earlier. But just as we looked at in adjectives, even for adverbs, the properties of the adverb which are primary will be closest to the properties of the verb which are primary will be closest to the verb, and those which are, as I said, sequentially less and less related would be further and further away. So if you look at the basic statement there, we are saying Zakir Hussain played the tabla brilliantly at the park yesterday. What are we saying? He played. What is the object of that? The tabla. So we know that the adverbs have to come after the verb and its direct object. So Zakir Hussain played the tabla. Brilliantly is the manner, because that's the first thing about the playing that should be relevant. At the park is the time, and that is the next thing that will be relevant. I mean is the place, and that will be the next thing that's relevant. And yesterday is the time, and that will be the last thing that's relevant. So there is a sequence. You follow manner, place and time. Now therefore that means Zakir Hussain played the tabla brilliantly, manner, at the park, place, yesterday, time. Now can I shift any of these things up to the start of the sentence? I can, depending on what my focus is. I can't shift brilliantly though, because brilliantly is so related to playing the tabla that I can't move that. Can I move the yesterday? I can, when I want to focus on yesterday. So I can say yesterday, comma, Zakir Hussain played the tabla brilliantly at the park. Can I shift at the park yesterday, because I want to focus on the entire thing of what happened at the park yesterday? Then I can say at the park yesterday, Zakir Hussain played the tabla brilliantly. Now suppose I want to focus first on the day and then at the place, then I can say yesterday, comma, at the park, comma, Zakir Hussain played the tabla brilliantly. But you recognize your standard statement is right up there on top, the first one. All the others are alterations because you want to bring in emphasis, but because you are emphasizing and you shift it, you have to use commas to let the reader know that I have moved it away from its standard place only for the purpose of emphasis. So keep this in mind when we are talking about sequencing adverbs that bring in the manner, place and time after the verb. Okay, let's move on.